Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, July 9th, 2018. As promised, we're back in the saddle after taking a break for the Independence Day week. And there is so much news. I'm having a hard time. I think I could do an hour-long podcast today and not cover all of the important things that have developed since I last spoke to you. But I'm going to do my best. And I open today with mainstream media malpractice once again. And I want to focus on two key stories that are still in the news. The Russiagate narrative and the most recent report or interim statement issued by the Senate Intelligence Committee and its Russiagate investigation, and the new assertions that have surfaced in England as a woman has been killed in Salisbury, and they are linking it to the Novichok release that goes back to March. And in both of these cases, we are seeing innuendo, allegations, leaks, unproven government assertions treated as fact. And they become a part of a narrative that is very hard to break down after the fact. So let's start with the update from the Senate Intelligence Committee, which does separate itself from the House Intelligence Committee. It doesn't appear to be completely political. But the circular argument and evidence, and I put that in air quotes, that is being cited in this most recent report from the committee is frustrating, and it is being treated by the corporate media in this country as proof that Russia interfered, meddled in the election in 2016, and tilted the result in favor of Donald Trump. And as you know, I remain highly skeptical of these assertions, and I have to from time to time restate that I believe Trump is corrupt. I believe he has been obstructing justice. I think he is impeachable and has been from day one. But I continue to follow what I see as evidence. And there is no new evidence in this Senate committee update. And what they do is embrace the evidence-free assessment that was published on January 6th of 2017, and it was attributed to 3 intelligence services. And they refer to that as the ICA, the Intelligence Community Assessment. For example, they claim that the January 2017 report was a good intelligence product, a sound intelligence product, to quote word for word. Then they proceed to tell us that the ICA pointed to initial evidence of Russian activities, and that the judgment is supported by the evidence presented in the ICA. But there isn't any evidence there. And there's no evidence here. There's no new evidence. There is no revelation of assertions from the past that are now supported by evidence that came up in the committee's exhaustive investigations. Since the ICA was published, the committee has learned more about Russian attempts to infiltrate state election infrastructure. Only we've learned that they weren't successful. And this comes close to contradicting the ICA's assertion that no vote tallies were affected by this Russian interference. And then the committee tries to one-up the intelligence community report, the assessment, by saying that they have exposed a far more extensive Russian effort to manipulate social media outlets to sow discord and interfere in the 2016 election and American society. That's a pretty sweeping charge. And as I have described to you repeatedly, the Russian attempts to use social media were ham-handed. Many of them came actually after the election. They were not tightly focused the way, say, the Trump campaign's social media posting, Facebook in particular. How carefully targeted all that was. And then when you look at sowing discord, Donald Trump, the compliant American media that allowed him to use his Twitter attacks every day, they amplified his racism. All of the name-calling, all of the attacks, wasn't that a pretty effective campaign of sowing discord? And so it goes. Over the weekend, I posted a comment on Facebook. I wrote, "Here's a little critical thinking exercise. Just read the 7-page report from the Senate Intel Committee, which most media say proves that Russia meddled in the 2016 election. Scour it for new evidence or any evidence that Russia hacked the DNC, gave it to WikiLeaks, and caused Trump to win. They call the January 17 Intel assessment a sound intelligence product, when anyone who's actually read it knows it's not. The only criticism is that the earlier report didn't offer enough details of the impact of RT's propaganda in 2016. But can anyone show there was any impact from RT? Well, it only took a few minutes for Paul Anderson, who's a man I have some respect for. I worked with him on a political campaign, a congressional race here in California, 6 years ago. And he opens with a triple smear. He says, "I'll remember this RNC/Trump/Putin-inspired post when Mueller releases his reports and referral to Congress. Really, Peter, it's sad to see someone with your brain and chops succumb to more Russian propaganda." Now, do you notice he didn't comment on the Senate Intelligence Committee report? He didn't agree or disagree with my assessment of it. He didn't participate in the critical thinking exercise. He just got critical. And the casual way that people are willing to smear those who present contrasting or conflicting views regarding the Russiagate scandal continues to stun me. And so people just, reach for the, "You're a tool of Putin." This one gal said, "Did I marry a Russian mail-order bride?" As if that would affect my thinking. And here's Pam saying, "You're not the only one disappointed with Mr. Collins. Russia is not our friend." So I responded to Anderson. I said, "That's a triple smear with Russian propaganda on top. How is it that RNC Trump Putin inspired, how is it that to be skeptical of the previous assessments and the latest endorsement from the Senate committee? If you've actually read them, please show us what evidence you found. Feel free to disagree with my views and offer your own, but spare me the juvenile name-calling." And he didn't apologize or in any way soften his comments. He doubled down. The Senate report is a placeholder. It says right on the front page that the report is not complete and will be made public subject to classification review. That's not all it does. So really, you're obfuscating the issue. Why your anti-intelligence zealotry extends to something that strikes at the very core of our democracy is beyond me. Well, let's take a look at consortiumnews.com, where former U.S. Ambassador to Moscow, Jack Matlock, wrote a piece entitled, "Former U.S. Envoy to Moscow Calls Intelligence Report on Alleged Russian Interference Politically Motivated." And Matlock goes into great detail about the reports he used to get when he was the ambassador to Russia. And he describes the difference between the materials he read and what was called the ICA, the Intelligence Community Assessment. And he shreds it right before your eyes as the words go by. Then he talks about how he had never seen a report where the FBI was involved, and he'd never seen one where the Bureau of Intelligence Research at the State Department was excluded. And both of those present in the current narrative. And he says that he's been informed by a senior State Department official that the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence Research did, in fact, have a different opinion, but was not allowed to express it. So the January report was not one of the intelligence community, but rather of 3 intelligence agencies, 2 of which have no responsibility or necessarily any competence to judge foreign intentions. He says the report is full of assertion, innuendo, description of capabilities, but largely devoid of any evidence to substantiate its assertions. This is explained by claiming that much of the evidence is classified, can't be disclosed without revealing sources and methods. The assertions are made with high confidence or occasionally moderate confidence. Having read many intelligence reports, I can tell you that if there is irrefutable evidence of something, it will be stated as a fact. The use of the term high confidence is what most normal people would call our best guess. Moderate confidence means, quote, some of our analysts think this might be true. So it is quite a takedown. I encourage you to read it. And just to let you know that I am not blind when voices surface even in the corporate media that counter the official narrative, here's a nice exception. Philip Bump, writing today at the Washington Post. The headline reads, "The market demands a broad Trump-Russia theory, but the evidence doesn't support one." And he talks about David Korn at Mother Jones, who together with Michael Isikoff wrote a book and they promote the collusion theory. Then he takes a look at Jonathan Chait and his widely circulated piece at New York Magazine. And Bump writes here, Chait is smart enough not to present his exhaustive theory of mind-boggling collusion as proof. Instead, he adds that qualifying theory the way reporters add alleged before descriptions of guys arrested holding big sacks of money while walking out of bank vaults. There are a lot of people on the political left, says Bump, who believe not only that political malfeasance has been proved, but that in fact collusion and illegality have as well. He cites the DNC lawsuit that was made public in April, which he says doesn't have much chance of becoming a winning court document, but is a way of laying out the narrative as it is seen by that side of the dispute. And so it's interesting to see. He sums it up saying, the DNC almost certainly didn't file its lawsuit because it thought that Trump's allies would wind up in jail. Sometimes a case is made because people want to hear the case be made, not because the case is strong. He says, there is nothing, talking about the Facebook activity. Well, CNN found that Russians targeted Michigan and Wisconsin, but other data revealed that Maryland was targeted by 5 times as many ads as Wisconsin. Most of the Wisconsin ads ran during the primary. More ads targeted the District of Columbia than Pennsylvania. What's more, the targeting was generally very broad. There is nothing public that indicates that the Russian targeting was based on anything other than a casual understanding of American politics. So there are people who are paying attention, who are looking at the actual evidence and honestly reporting it. And Bump deserves praise for bucking the tide at the Washington Post these days. Then we have the latest attempt to lie about and smear Glenn Greenwald. You may know he went to Moscow recently. It was last week or the week before. He met with Ed Snowden. He participated in a panel about fake news. And he opens his article by noting that in 2016, Malcolm Nance, who is a paid contributor to MSNBC and described as a former intelligence analyst of some sort, well, he lied by saying Jill Stein has a show on Russia Today. That false statement has never been corrected or acknowledged by MSNBC. And so Greenwald uses that as the focal point as he then continues. Last week, I traveled to Moscow to meet with Snowden as well as participate in a cybersecurity conference on a panel regarding fake news. And he notes that The Intercept paid for his travel and he got no fee from a Russian or anybody else for the trip. But that allowed Malcolm Nance to lie about him. And he said that, Nance tweeted, Glenn Greenwald shows his true colors as an agent of Trump and Moscow. Now we know why he helped Snowden defect, covers for WikiLeaks' attack on democracy, and shills for Fox News. He's deep in the Kremlin pocket. Well, here's Greenwald's response. He's been lied about on purpose. Nance has 420,000 Twitter followers. And he says none of Nance's statements here is opinion. These claims, especially that I'm an agent of Moscow and deep in the Kremlin pocket, are intended to be factual statements, that I work for and am paid by Russia and the Kremlin, and that I aided Snowden in defecting to Moscow. They are all outright lies. There is no other way to describe them. And after I noted that they were lies, Nance reaffirmed them and said how proud he was to have broadcast them. Greenwald continues, NBC News and MSNBC have essentially merged with the CIA and intelligence community and thus used their tactics. The network is filled with former generals and CIA officials who are part of the community that pioneered these smear tactics of accusing journalists and critics they dislike of being traitors, spies, and Kremlin loyalists. And it's also what the Democratic Party is. This is their go-to tactic. After my colleague Li Feng reported on the numerous corporate interests for which Howard Dean secretly shills in exchange for large payments, everything from pharmaceutical companies to the Iranian group, the cult MEK, Dean tweeted, "Would be interesting to find out if the Intercept gets money from Russia or Iran." So the content of what you say doesn't matter. If it is perceived as somehow critical of or dangerous to the MSNBC-driven, DNC-embraced, mainstream media-amplified theories about Russia, then you, my friend, are the problem. I am the problem. I'm a commie pinko, Putin sympathizer, Russia's not our friend. It's maddening. I would be delighted to take on any of these people in an argument on the merits. But sliming people is the tactic of people who don't have confidence in a debate on the merits. And here's a deflection scheme using the same tactics from the right. You know, Jim Jordan is this far-right congressman from Ohio, a former wrestling coach at Ohio State. Sound like Dennis Hastert? Well, Jim Jordan has been accused by a number of former wrestlers at Ohio State that he was aware that they had a doctor who'd like to fondle the privates of wrestlers, Dr. Richard Strauss. And Jordan, who is entitled to his denials, although we've seen how often these don't hold up under close scrutiny and more people come forward to counter the denials, let's take those at face value. Well, his allies are saying he's being attacked by deep state actors because of his challenge to the Russiagate narrative. It just flies in all directions, but nobody wants to really get at the meat of these issues. It's easier to smear your opponent. And I can't make a lot out of this, but I want to share with you that Marcy Wheeler, the highly regarded blogger, has revealed, at least partially, that she turned in one of her sources to the Robert Mueller investigation. Wheeler says, "On its face, I broke one of the cardinal rules of journalism, but what he was doing should cause a source to lose protection. It's not a decision I regret." Now, we don't know what criminal behavior this source was involved in that caused Marcy Wheeler to report him. The hints are that hours after the polls closed in November of 2016, this source predicted that Mike Flynn, Trump's appointee for National Security Advisor, would be meeting with Team al-Assad within 48 hours. And that, of course, is linked in many minds to Russia, but that's not proven. It's just conjecture. It's circumstantial. So, Wheeler won't say when she went to the FBI other than it was in 2017, and that was the year that Flynn pled guilty to one count of lying to the FBI about his contact with the Russian government. And then he'd been fired the previous February, and perhaps he was this source. That is just one possibility. So I don't want to go too much deeper here because I don't have enough to work with. But I do think that this is an interesting, anomalous development that everybody deserves to know about. Now to the case in Salisbury, England, where we've learned that a couple, 44-year-old Dawn Sturgis and her boyfriend Charlie Rowley, age 45, both were in contact with some sort of substance. And on Sunday night, Dawn Sturgis died in the hospital in Salisbury, England. Now, that's pretty much what we know. We know that the couple were both longtime addicts who were both in recovery. They met as people who had been in some sort of recovery program together. We also know that they had roamed around Amesbury and Salisbury on the day that they fell ill. And what's fascinating here is, once again, the American corporate media merges things that are being reported that we deserve to know but can't be proven with things that are asserted to be true. So, here's an account from the New York Times. The couple was exposed a week ago to traces of a Soviet-developed nerve agent. There's no reported, suspected, alleged. It's just a statement of fact. They were exposed a week ago to traces of a Soviet-developed nerve agent. They likely came into contact with it by picking up a vial, syringe, or ampule discarded by a would-be assassin who took to the city of Salisbury in southern England months ago to target a former Russian spy, police said. Now, at least that lengthy string of allegations that I read last ends with the tag, police said. That allows the reader to say, oh, okay, that may or may not be true. But this is the insidious wave of yellow journalism that we're experiencing in the world today. And the New York Times is the one that has its own HBO series about how great their capital J journalism is. So here's more from the Times. After the former Soviet spy Skripal and his daughter Yulia collapsed, British officials declared confidently that Russia was at fault, in large part because of the obscure poison involved. It was one of a strain of nerve agents known as Novichok that they say is kept under tight control by the Russian authorities. But anybody who goes to Amazon can find the book published by a former Soviet scientist on how you make Novichok. It's not a secret. And the reaction of people, the Skripals and now Charlie and Ms. Sturgis, doesn't add up. It's not consistent. But we do get new information. Charlie and, Vanessa, is that her name? Dawn. Charlie and Dawn were foaming at the mouth. Their pupils were pinpoints. They had hallucinations. These were similar to those that emerged with the three previous victims, the Skripals and the detective, Nick Bailey. But this is the first time we've heard those details about the Skripals. They have kept all of the information about the symptoms, the treatment, and the recovery of the Skripals completely off record. Now, they do note that the couple were physically fragile after years of substance abuse, which compromises the liver's ability to detoxify the body. But then there are more questions. Because if you take a look at Craig Murray's blog, where he talks about the Amesbury mystery before the announcement that Dawn Sturgis had died, he said, well, the media quoted the government 3 months ago. Thusly, Professor Robert Stockman of the University of Nottingham said traces of nerve agents did not linger. He added these agents react with water to degrade, including moisture in the air, so they'd have a very limited lifetime. We were told that rain may have diluted the Novichok on the door handle of the Skripal home, and that's been given as the reason why they didn't die. And so Craig Murray muses, do you remember when Novichok was the most deadly of substances, many times more powerful than VX or sarin, causing death in seconds? But then when that needed to be altered to fit the government Skripal story, they found scientists to explain that actually no, it was pretty slow acting, absorbed gradually through the skin, and not all that deadly. And so there are just too many questions here that deserve to be answered. And consider the source. This is George Galloway, longtime member of Parliament and journalist in Britain, who now writes and broadcasts on RT. Yes, the Russian media outlet. And he describes how the government has recently purchased the homes in Salisbury of the Skripals and Detective Nick Bailey. Both houses have been basically sealed up, but they didn't buy the pizza parlor where they hung out or the pub where they went for a drink before they were stricken. Later he says, no evidence, none whatsoever, has been produced by the government or any state authorities which gives the slightest justification to Theresa May's rush to judgment and blame issued peremptorily against the Russian Federation, and blaming Putin himself. It is established by the very fact the Skripals survived that what struck them was not Novichok. Now, you may be confused at this point, and that's not my intention. But understand that there are significant challenges to the official narrative on these Novichok poisonings, but you won't read them in the American corporate media. They will slavishly hew to the line established by the British government. And I don't have time to detail this one for you today, but the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons issued a preliminary report on their investigation into Duma, the town near Damascus, that was the scene of a suspected April 7th chemical incident. They say it's too early to come to conclusions, but they did find various chlorinated organic chemicals at the site. But they said that the initial test results showed no organophosphorus nerve agents or their degradation products were detected in samples taken from people allegedly exposed or in the environment. And we bombed Syria based on the conclusions of our intelligence authorities that there was a nerve agent released. It was not alleged to simply be a chlorine chemical weapon. Maybe you think this is splitting hairs. But when people die, when decisions are made, for example, in the Skripal case, to withdraw ambassadors and consular personnel all over the world from Russia, these are serious steps, and they deserve to be based on publicly accessible evidence. And our media has a duty to find that evidence and expose it, or to expose that there is no evidence. And that's where the failures have been, in my humble opinion. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And I went to the P.O. Box over the weekend and was stunned to receive a check from one of our longest and most generous supporters, John Zweibel in Hawaii. I won't embarrass him with the amount of the check, but it is a big boost to the coffers here at peterbcollins.com. Maybe you can't match him in generosity, but you could make a statement by taking out a $5 a month subscription. Just drop by peterbcollins.com, click on the menu tab, pull down Become a Subscriber, you land on the sign-up page, and you can take care of business. And if you're good for $50, I'll give you an annual subscription and send you a copy of John Dist's new rock and roll CD called American University. Well, on Friday, Theresa May, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, called her cabinet to her summer home, her country home at Chequers, a 16th century mansion northwest of London. And she laid down the law. She made her cabinet members give up their cell phones, their smart watches, and their car and driver when they came into her home. And she said that they either support her position on Brexit or they should resign immediately, and if they do, they would be stripped of their ministerial limousine and forced to walk a mile down her driveway to meet a private car service, probably Uber. So May spent the weekend thinking, I got this all under control. I got it all zipped up. And today all hell broke loose. Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, was the second minister to leave the cabinet within 24 hours, following the chief negotiator of Brexit, David Davis. And there was a third one you've never heard of who also quit the cabinet. All of this as our disruptor-in-chief is bringing his Twitter phone, and he'll be in London later this week as he goes to disrupt NATO, followed by his mano-a-mano talk with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. Oh, it's going to be a wild week. A wild, wild week. The initial reports from North Korea, where Secretary of State and most recently CIA boss Mike Pompeo went to meet with the top staff of Kim Jong-un. Well, North Korea said that it was really disappointing because Pompeo was pushing a unilateral and gangster-like demand for denuclearization, which it called deeply regrettable. Mike Pompeo said the talks were productive and covered all of the main topics he wanted to talk about. There's a big gap there. It's going to be a long one. And Trump's desire to snap his fingers and say, oh, I fixed that? That's kind of his premature ejaculation, like George W. Bush's mission accomplished photo op, if you remember that one. Well, Scott Pruitt is gone, and the scandals that engulfed him, the deep damage to environmental regulations that he did in just, 16, 17 months as director of the EPA? Well, his last stab, as he filled out his resignation letter with all that blessed bullshit in it, well, he killed some rules that will allow the manufacture of some 10 to 15,000 what are called glider trucks. And these are trucks where they install new, old engines in new chassis. These are gross polluting engines. They don't meet the current standards. And the EPA has announced that through the end of 2019, it will not enforce the annual cap of 300 of these glider smokestacks to be built. And we learned some of the details of the people who got burned by Scott Pruitt. Let me just single out one. Her name is Madeline Morris, and she was fired as one of Pruitt's schedulers after she balked at deleting embarrassing meetings from his public schedule. And who was Madeline Morris? Well, she spent a decade in Washington working for Denny Rayburg, a Montana Republican, and then she went to work as a federal affairs specialist for Koch Company's public sector. Those are the kind of people that Scott Pruitt was hiring. And what about his number two, the guy who's acting EPA administrator? The guy who was a lobbyist for clean coal for Murray Energy before he re-entered the government? Yeah, he worked at EPA under Bush after he'd been chief of staff to Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma, the leader of climate deniers. Oh, it's ugly, and it will get uglier. For poor people who rely on Obamacare, twin blasts during the holiday break, the Trump administration is suspending a program that pays billions of dollars to insurers to stabilize health insurance under the Affordable Care Act. It will likely lead to huge disruption in the insurance markets and predictable but unassessed increases in insurance premiums. And if you live in Kentucky, I feel real bad for you, because your governor tried to impose a set of workplace regulations. If you get Medicaid, you had to train for a job or be working. And of course, they didn't do any studies to find out if this is even practical. And a federal judge who'd been appointed by Obama ruled that the Trump administration's approval of the plan had been arbitrary and capricious. It had not adequately considered whether the plan would help the state furnish medical assistance to its citizens, because they know that as many as 95,000 people would lose coverage. And in retaliation, the governor has announced, that's Matt Bevin, the Republican governor, that he is going to make cuts in Medicaid. Now, this work requirement didn't have any savings for the state of Kentucky. It was just rich people imposing opportunity on poor people. And so his response is to take it out on poor people. The world has been watching as lives are being saved in northern Thailand. As of right now, a total of 8 people have been extracted from the cave. They swam out parts of the underwater passages, and there are now, I think, 5 remaining. So I'm hopeful about the outcome there. But in southern Thailand, the island of Phuket, which I once visited back in the 1980s, was the scene of just really rough seas, and 2 tourist boats capsized, leaving at least 33 people dead. And I want to tell you a quick story. When I was in Thailand, in Phuket, I went on a tour boat to visit one of the caves where they collect the birds' nests for bird's nest soup. And as the boat approached the cave, the captain went a little too far, and the bow of the boat made contact with the rocky surface there. And there was this clamor between the captain and the crew yelling about this and that, and they came up with a can of Raid. And I said, wait a minute, they bumped the cave and this board fell off. Well, the ship was all made of wood, and it was infested with termites. And they thought that was bad PR for a tourist like me, so they wanted to kill the termites. Maritime safety in Thailand leaves a little to be desired. And finally today, I want to say farewell to Big Ed Schultz. Ed Schultz was a major figure in progressive media the last 15 years, and he was an unusual person for that role. Back in 2003, when people like me and Tom Hartman were doing progressive talk radio for IE America, we were on a satellite channel, we were on a couple of radio stations around the country. We were hoping that Tom Daschle was going to shower us with the startup capital needed to form a real progressive radio network. And instead, he selected Big Ed Schultz. And Ed was this, sportsman, recovering Republican from frickin' Fargo. And Ed did bust some chops as he was climbing his ladder to success. And Ed was a very aggressive guy, not always friendly to people he considered a competitor. But his radio show made a big impact. He wasn't part of the Air America tribe, and so he showed up on different stations around the country, sometimes in direct competition with Air America. But he survived, Air America didn't. And while I quibble with the way he did his radio show, he often was just an echo chamber for the Democrats, and they relied on him for that. He also, I thought, was pretty weak on foreign policy. And the last thing I'll say about the radio show was that he played hardball. And when things got rough for progressive radio about 2011, 2012, I was working with a guy named Jeff Santos from Boston, and we didn't do it on purpose, but we took a slot on a station in Detroit that Ed Schultz had. And he fought back in ways that I will only say were hardly progressive and probably ran afoul of antitrust law. But that said, I want to end on a positive note, because when Ed Schultz went to MSNBC, he had to fight the power in NBC management. And they fired him once. They took him off the daytime lineup, put him on the weekends. He held firm. Then they brought him back in 2016, and he was fired again because he supported Bernie Sanders. And for that, I will have undying respect for Ed Schultz. He held his own. He didn't cave in like so many of the other hosts and just go for Hillary. Ed was a big, burly guy, a redhead, a football star back in college, flew his own plane, loved to fish and hunt. And I hope that when he passed away at the age of 64, he had a rod and reel in his hands. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. It's a little longer than usual today. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.